Kaylee was a bright person. She had a bright smile. She had a bright future. Kaylee Gonsalves had a contagious laugh. Kaylee was beautiful inside and out.
Xana was one of those people that you could not possibly be sad around. She was entirely herself all the time.
Ethan was family, the life of the party, always optimistic.
A moment of silence held for each of the victims who were found stabbed to death in their off-campus home on November 13th of last year. Kaylee's father says the tributes provide some comfort on a day that will always be painful.
It helps us know that our girl wasn't just, something that people can just forget about.
In the early hours of November 13, 2022, something happened inside a quiet rental house near the campus of the University of Idaho that would stun an entire nation. 4 college students who had spent the evening like thousands of other young people across America, laughing with friends, attending social gatherings, sending late-night texts, were brutally killed in their home. Within hours, the peaceful college town of Moscow, Idaho would become the center of one of the most widely followed homicide investigations in recent U.S. history. For weeks, investigators worked with very little public information while fear and speculation spread across the country. But what began as a mystery inside a 3-story house on King Road would eventually lead authorities to a criminology graduate student living just miles away. His name was Bryan Kohberger, and more than 2 years after the murders, he would stand in court and admit to killing all 4 victims. This is the story of what happened, beginning with the final hours before the attack. On the evening of Saturday, November 12, 2022, life in Moscow followed the familiar rhythm of a college weekend. The city of about 25,000 residents sits in northern Idaho near the Washington state border, and the University of Idaho campus is at the center of its community. Students filled restaurants, fraternity houses, and bars as they enjoyed a typical Saturday night. Among them were 4 young people whose lives were closely connected through friendship and campus life: Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Kaylee Gonsalves and Madison Mogen were lifelong best friends who had known each other since childhood. Both were 21 years old and lived at a rental house located at 1122 King Road, just a short distance from campus. The house was shared with several other roommates and was known among friends as a social place where students frequently gathered. That night, Gonsalves and Mogen went out together in Moscow, spending time in the downtown area before eventually returning home. Elsewhere that evening, Ethan Chapin attended a formal event with his sister before going to the Sigma Chi fraternity house. Chapin was 20 years old and a member of the fraternity. His girlfriend, Xana Kernodle, who was also 20, lived at the King Road residence and had been spending time with him that evening. Later in the night, the two returned to the house together. 2 other roommates who lived in the house also went out separately that night and returned later. By the early morning hours of November 13, most of the residents had settled in for the night. Shortly after 4:00 a.m., a DoorDash delivery arrived for Xana Kernodle. Prosecutors later confirmed that the order was delivered around that time, indicating that at least one person in the house was still awake. Just minutes later, a man approached the residence. According to prosecutors, Bryan Kohberger entered the home through the sliding glass door at the rear of the kitchen. The house was built on a slope, meaning the kitchen entrance was located on the 2nd floor from the back of the building. From there, stairs led both up and down to other levels of the residence. Investigators later reconstructed that Kohberger moved upstairs toward the 3rd floor. On that level, Kaylee Gonsalves and Madison Mogen were in a bedroom together. Inside that room, both women were stabbed to death. A nearby security camera located less than 50 feet from the house recorded audio around 4:17. The recording captured the sound of a dog barking, followed by distorted noises that investigators described as voices or a whimper, and then a loud thud. At the time those sounds were recorded, Xana Kernodle was still awake in her bedroom on the 2nd floor. Prosecutors later stated that as Kohberger moved through the house after the attacks upstairs, he encountered Kernodle. What followed was another violent confrontation. Kernodle was fatally stabbed. Ethan Chapin, who had been sleeping in Kernodle's bedroom, was also attacked and killed. During the same time frame, one of the surviving roommates, identified in court documents as D.M., reported hearing unusual noises coming from other areas of the house. According to investigators, she opened her bedroom door several times during the early morning hours after hearing what she believed might be someone playing with the dog upstairs. At one point, she heard a voice saying something similar to, "There's someone here." Moments later, she heard crying coming from Zana Kernadle's room. When she opened the door again, she saw a man dressed in black clothing and wearing a mask covering his nose and mouth walking past her in the hallway. The man walked toward the sliding glass door and exited the residence. The roommate later described him as being at least 5 feet 10 inches tall with an athletic build and distinctive bushy eyebrows. She locked herself in her room after the man left. Around the same time, text messages were exchanged between the two surviving roommates. The messages showed confusion and growing fear as they tried to reach the other residents in the house. "No one is answering," one roommate texted. "I'm really confused right now." Another message followed, "I'm freaking out." Despite the disturbing sounds and unanswered calls, the roommates did not immediately realize the scale of what had happened inside the house. Hours later, sometime before noon, one of the roommates called friends to come to the residence because they believed one of the victims had passed out and could not be awakened. At 11:58 a.m., a call was placed to emergency services reporting an unconscious person. When officers from the Moscow Police Department arrived at the scene, they quickly realized the situation was far more serious than initially reported. Inside the house, they discovered 4 victims suffering from fatal stab wounds. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Zana Kernadle, and Ethan Chapin were pronounced dead at the scene. Within minutes, the location was transformed from a college residence into an active homicide investigation. Investigators secured the property and began processing what would become one of the most complex crime scenes the small department had ever handled. The murders sent immediate shockwaves through Moscow and across the University of Idaho campus. News spread rapidly through social media and national television networks. Students and residents struggled to understand how 4 young people could be killed inside their own home while others in the house survived. In the early days following the murders, investigators released very little information publicly. Authorities focused on collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing the movements of everyone connected to the victims. What they did not yet reveal was that among the evidence collected at the crime scene was an item that would later become one of the most important forensic links in the case. It was a knife sheath left behind near one of the victims. And the DNA recovered from that sheath would eventually point investigators toward a suspect living just a few miles away. But at that moment, in the days immediately after the killings, the identity of the killer remained unknown, and the search for answers had only just begun. The sheath appeared to have once held a fixed-blade knife, though the weapon itself was not located at the scene. Forensic analysts processed the sheath for biological evidence and ultimately recovered a single source of male DNA from the snap closure. At that point, investigators did not yet know whose DNA it was, but it was cataloged as a critical piece of evidence. While forensic work continued, investigators focused heavily on surveillance footage collected from homes and businesses around the neighborhood. Hours of video were reviewed in an effort to identify any vehicles that had passed near the King Road residence during the early morning hours. Analysts eventually identified a white sedan repeatedly appearing in footage taken near the house during the time frame of the murders. The vehicle drove past the residence several times before entering the area again shortly after 4:00 a.m. Investigators determined the vehicle was a white Hyundai Elantra manufactured between 2011 and 2013. Once the vehicle type was identified, police began searching vehicle registration databases for matching cars in the region. On December 7, 2022, authorities publicly announced they were attempting to identify the driver of a white Hyundai Elantra seen near the crime scene. The announcement prompted thousands of tips from the public. Just days before that public request, another development had quietly occurred. On November 29, a police officer with Washington State University reviewed vehicle records on campus and located a white Hyundai Elantra registered to a graduate student named Bryan Kohberger. Kohberger was a 28-year-old doctoral student studying criminology at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, located about 10 miles west of Moscow. His vehicle matched the description investigators were seeking. Detectives soon began examining Kohberger's movements through digital evidence. A search of his cell phone records revealed patterns that caught investigators' attention. Cell site location data showed that Kohberger's phone had been near the King Road residence on at least 12 occasions before the murders, dating back as far as August 2022. The records also showed his phone traveling toward Moscow in the early morning hours of November 13. However, the phone signal stopped transmitting data between 2:47 a.m. and 4:48 a.m., a gap that covered the timeframe when the murders occurred. Investigators later stated in court documents that the device being inactive during that period was consistent with someone attempting to conceal their location. Phone data also showed that later that same morning at approximately 9:00 a.m., the device returned to the vicinity of the King Road neighborhood for a brief period before traveling back toward Pullman. As investigators developed these leads, they also continued analyzing the DNA recovered from the knife sheath. Because the profile did not initially match anyone in criminal databases, investigators used a technique involving genetic genealogy. In late December, they traveled to Pennsylvania, where Kohberger's family lived, to gather additional evidence. On December 27, 2022, investigators collected trash that had been placed outside the Kohberger family residence. Laboratory analysis later revealed that DNA obtained from that trash belonged to the father of the individual whose DNA had been found on the knife sheath recovered from the crime scene. The genetic connection provided investigators with probable cause linking Bryan Kohberger to the murders. 3 days later, in the early hours of December 30, law enforcement officers moved to make the arrest. Agents from the FBI and Pennsylvania State Police arrived at the Kohberger family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Inside the residence, they arrested Bryan Kohberger on an active warrant charging him with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary in connection with the killings in Idaho. The arrest came after investigators had been quietly tracking Kohberger across the country. Earlier in December, after the fall semester ended at Washington State University, Kohberger had left Washington and driven to Pennsylvania with his father in the same white Hyundai Elantra investigators had been monitoring. During the cross-country trip, the vehicle had been stopped twice by police in Indiana on December 15. The first stop was conducted by the Hancock County Sheriff's Office for speeding. Just 9 minutes later, the vehicle was stopped again by an Indiana State Police trooper for following another vehicle too closely. Both stops resulted in verbal warnings, and officers at the time had no information linking Kohberger to the Idaho homicide investigation. After his arrest in Pennsylvania, Kohberger was taken into custody and held while legal proceedings began to extradite him back to Idaho. On January 4, 2023, he was transported to Moscow, Idaho, where he was booked into the Latta County Jail. As news of the arrest spread across the country, the case that had gripped national attention entered a new phase. Investigators released a probable cause affidavit outlining the evidence that had led them to Kohberger. The document detailed the surveillance footage of the white Hyundai Elantra, the cell phone data placing him near the victim's residence, and the DNA recovered from the knife sheath. The affidavit also included the statement from the surviving roommate who had seen a masked man walking through the house shortly after the murders. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought some measure of relief but also raised many questions. The motive behind the killings remained unclear, and authorities said they had not found evidence that Kohberger had any direct relationship with the victims. As the criminal case moved forward, the next stage would take place inside the courtroom, where prosecutors would begin presenting the evidence against him and the legal process would unfold over the following years. But even after the arrest, the central question remained unanswered: why had 4 students been targeted inside their home? That question would continue to follow the case as it moved toward trial. By the time Bryan Kohberger was returned to Idaho in early January 2023, the case had already become one of the most closely followed criminal investigations in the United States. The killings had shocked the community in Moscow, Idaho, and drawn national attention from major media outlets. But with the suspect now in custody, the focus shifted from the investigation itself to the long legal process that would determine how the case would ultimately be resolved. After arriving in Idaho on January 4, 2023, Kohberger was booked into the Latta County Jail to await his first court appearances. Prosecutors formally charged him with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. Under Idaho law, the charges carried the possibility of the death penalty if he were convicted. In the weeks that followed, students slowly returned to the University of Idaho campus. Classes resumed on January 11 for the first time since the arrest. For many students and families connected to the victims, returning to campus was an emotional experience. Ethan Chapin's siblings, who also attended the university, were among those who came back to continue their studies despite the trauma surrounding the case. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Kohberger moved through the court system. On May 22, 2023, he appeared for his arraignment hearing in Latta County District Court. During the hearing, Kohberger exercised his legal right to stand silent when asked to enter a plea. Because he did not respond, the presiding judge entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf, allowing the case to proceed toward trial. Over the next several months, both prosecutors and defense attorneys began preparing for what was expected to be a lengthy and complex trial. The defense team filed motions challenging certain pieces of evidence, including the DNA evidence collected from the knife sheath. Thuy also attempted to have the death penalty removed as a possible sentence. Those motions were denied by the court. In August 2023, defense attorneys submitted an alibi notice stating that Kohberger claimed he had been driving alone on the night of the murders. According to the filing, he was traveling through rural areas during the timeframe when the killings occurred. While the legal battle continued, the physical location of the crime itself was undergoing a significant change. The house at 1122 King Road had remained standing for more than a year after the murders, serving as a constant reminder of the tragedy. In 2023, the property owner donated the house to the University of Idaho. On December 28, 2023, demolition crews arrived before sunrise and began tearing down the structure. The demolition took less than 2 hours. University officials stated that removing the house was intended to help the community move forward and begin healing, although some family members of the victims had opposed the decision. As the case progressed through pre-trial hearings, another major development occurred in 2024. Defense attorneys argued that extensive media coverage and public attention in Latah County had made it impossible to seat an impartial jury there. After reviewing the arguments, the judge agreed. On September 12, 2024, the court ordered the trial to be moved from Latah County to the city of Boise, Idaho. The change of venue was intended to ensure that jurors could be selected who had not already formed opinions about the case. Originally scheduled to begin in 2025, the trial date was later pushed back. In October 2024, the court rescheduled the trial from June 2025 to August 2025. Both sides continued filing motions and preparing evidence as the trial approached. Then, in the summer of 2025, the case took an unexpected turn. On June 30, 2025, just weeks before jury selection was scheduled to begin, prosecutors announced that Bryan Kohberger had agreed to plead guilty to all charges against him. The plea agreement resolved the case without a trial. Under the terms of the agreement, Kohberger pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. In exchange, prosecutors removed the death penalty as a possible punishment. The agreement also required Kohberger to waive his right to appeal his conviction. The decision to accept the plea agreement drew mixed reactions from the families of the victims. Some relatives supported the resolution because it ensured a conviction and life sentences without the uncertainty of a lengthy trial. Others expressed frustration that the agreement did not require Kohberger to explain his motive or reveal the location of the murder weapon, which had never been recovered. On July 2, 2025, Kohberger appeared in court for the change of plea hearing. It was the first time since his arrest that he spoke during court proceedings. During the hearing, the judge asked him a series of direct questions about the crimes. One by one, the judge named each victim and asked whether Kohberger had committed the murder. When asked if he killed Kaylee Goncalves, he responded yes. When asked about Madison Mogen, he again answered yes. He gave the same response when asked about Zana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin. After acknowledging each killing, Kohberger formally entered guilty pleas to all 4 counts of first-degree murder as well as the burglary charge. Family members of the victims were present in the courtroom as the pleas were entered. Many became emotional as the admissions confirmed the responsibility for the deaths of their loved ones. 3 weeks later, on July 23, 2025, Kohberger returned to court for sentencing. During the hearing, relatives of the victims delivered victim impact statements describing the devastation the murders had caused in their families and the lasting trauma experienced by those who survived. One of the surviving roommates who had seen the masked man leaving the house on the night of the murders also addressed the court. She described the panic attacks and emotional distress she had experienced since the events of November 13, 2022. When it came time for Kohberger to speak, he declined to make a statement. After hearing from the victims' families, the judge announced the final sentence. Bryan Kohberger was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole for the 4 murder convictions. In addition, he received the maximum sentence of 10 years for the burglary charge. The sentence ensured that he will spend the remainder of his life in prison. Despite the guilty pleas and the conclusion of the criminal case, one major question still remains unanswered. Investigators have said they were never able to determine a clear motive for the killings. Authorities also stated they could not confirm any personal relationship between Kohberger and the victims. With the sentencing complete, the legal proceedings came to an end, closing one of the most widely followed homicide cases in recent years. But for the families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, the loss remains permanent. 4 young lives ended inside a house on King Road in the early hours of November 13, 2022, a crime that began in silence and ended with a courtroom confession nearly 3 years later.